Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing incredibly well and that you're in good form, because we're on part 2 of our story tonight, and it's a very, very good story indeed. We're just learning about Aunt Louise. She's a very stubborn, very resolute woman, determined to do what she wants to do, and she's going to take her dog Pipkin out for a walk when the weather doesn't look particularly good, and nobody's very happy about this decision of hers. But unfortunately Aunt Louise is not to have her mind changed in a hurry, and so of course there are people naturally worrying about her when she goes out into those frisky conditions. And by all means share these stories with anybody who enjoys a good story. So let's continue now with part 2 of our story.
"Honestly, Louise, must you really go out today of all days?" my mother asked Aunt Louise. I could see she looked a little bemused by my aunt's stubborn enthusiasm, as you could hear the wind moaning outside. "Why don't you just take Pipkin outside to do his business for a while? Let him run around for a bit on his own, and then you can bring him back indoors. That's what most normal people would do. It's so bitter out there, very frosty. Why would you want to go for a walk, especially with a wind brewing over the tundra like that? It's going to get a lot worse, you know. The forecast is not good. Because as you so elegantly put it, Angela, I'm not normal, and I'm not remotely worried about the forecast, so to speak. You're exaggerating about the weather, as you always do. It's not that bad. I'm going to give Pipkin a 20-minute walk, for goodness sake. Besides, I find the exercise very invigorating," my aunt interjected. She knew my mother didn't approve of her going out of doors in conditions like this, but to Aunt Louise this was not a day where the psychogenic weather had persuaded her to remain indoors. Yes, there was an unmerciful, rather brisk wind blowing across the tundra. Yes, it was numbingly cold out of doors. But the precarious contrary wind was not feisty or bone-chilling enough, most obviously, to stop Aunt Louise from enjoying a walk with Pipkin, for nothing was going to stop her from her intrepid daredevil adventure, it would seem. She loved taking Pipkin outdoors, and she believed the dog was her own. My Aunt Louise seemed resolutely determined to go for a walk that morning, and there wasn't a jot anyone could do about it. She was like fixed cement that has been laid down by a builder. She was so set in her ways, there was no undoing her resolve. With a heavy heart I apprehensively watched Aunt Louise, throwing on her wintry outer garments, a woolly hat, a scarf, and a pair of red leather gloves, while Pipkin was wagging his blonde shaggy tail furiously and letting out some delighted woofs. I could see how ebulliently excited he was to go outdoors. Much like my aunt, he wasn't easily put off or dispirited by bad weather. Aunt Louise left the cabin, walking with Pipkin at her side. They trudged through the snow together. He was running ahead of her rather swiftly, his nose firmly devoted to sniffing the snow-covered ground, as if on the lookout for an intriguing scent trail he might pick up. Finally they were gone through the trees, and I could see them no longer, and all that was left behind was a trail of their footsteps that had disturbed the pristine snow. For some reason on this morning I couldn't shake off the direful, rather foreboding, disheartening feeling that something was going to go badly awry. I knew, of course, the unstable, somewhat vacillating weather could rarely turn, as it was as fickle and temperamental as a bloody-minded woman who'd been through half a dozen husbands already. I really wished with all my heart that Aunt Louise would not be so indomitably stubborn and uncompromising by insisting on taking Pipkin for a walk, when the wind, I secretly suspected, would not remain as deceptively tame and docile as it first appeared. Sometimes it was so much better to be safe rather than sorry. But Aunt Louise never looked at life through a lens of doubt. Instead, she optimistically seized the moment at every opportunity, and never really considered the ramifications or consequences of some of her choices. And yet when things did invariably go pear-shaped for her, she didn't seem to learn the lessons from her mistakes. "What's wrong with you, Donovan?" my sister Gretchen asked me. "Your face has gone all white, and you keep staring out the window. You're supposed to be playing snakes and ladders with me, or have you forgotten?" "It's just Aunt Louise," I told her. I mean, there's quite a wind whipping over the tundra, isn't there? My bed is going to get a lot worse. I don't want Aunt Louise to get caught up in a horrible windstorm. She thinks she's strong and all that, but she's no match for a hefty wind, is she? Mum couldn't talk her round, because, as usual, Aunt Louise refused to listen to anybody. She's the obstinate twin, that's what Mummy says. I just think she shouldn't be out there, that's all. I battled a great deal this morning, you know, just getting to the shed to put wood in the wicker basket, because the wind was so nasty and it was so cold. I mean, I was practically thrown over just taking the small journey to the shed. My sister rolled her eyes. You're 10 years old. You're a lot smaller than Aunt Louise is. She's got muscles, hasn't she? So she's strong like Mummy is. You worry too much. Aunt Louise is taking Pipkin for a 20-minute walk, that's all. It's only a short walk. She'll be back to teach us English very soon, like she always does. The wind isn't bad, you know. Well, not yet it isn't. But I don't fancy going out myself. But I'm not Aunt Louise. Come on, don't stare out of the window. Are you going to play with me or not? The game won't play itself, will it? Sorry, sis, I was just distracted. I was grateful to play the game of snakes and ladders that my sister had skillfully set up on the carpet, because if the truth be told, right now I didn't want to worry at all about Aunt Louise. It would seem she was all I could think about. I regret to say I was so much like my mother in that regard, who's inclined to worry about absolutely everything. I seem to have inherited that rather unfortunate gene from my mother that was going to bring me great discomfort in the future, I rather suspected. Aunt Louise would tell my mother that worrying was a complete waste of time and energy. It's like a car without any petrol, isn't it? It won't get you anywhere very fast, and theoretically it won't accomplish much. Soon I became absorbed in the game of snakes and ladders, and I almost forgot all about Aunt Louise. My mother eventually poked her head around the living room door, her eyebrows raised. Your Aunt Louise is not back yet, she asked. It's been 30 minutes, for goodness sake. What's taking her so outrageously long? My mother then walked through the living room, over to the window, staring out towards the trees, a frown playing out on her face. Honestly, that sister of mine is absolutely incorrigible. Look at the weather. The wind is not slowing down in the least, is it? It's getting significantly worse, and your aunt is still out there. She said she'd only be 20 minutes. What on earth is keeping her so long? Maybe she's lost track of time, I offered. She likes taking Pipkin for walks. You know what she's like. That is no excuse. Your Aunt Louise promised me emphatically she'd be no more than 20 minutes. She knows how much I worry about her. I'll have words with her when she gets back. She's supposed to be teaching you English right now. I could feel a thick, clammy fog developing in the back of my throat. Something didn't feel right. Aunt Louise should be back. She should have been back 10 minutes ago at the very least. My mother was right. What was keeping her? The wind was getting significantly worse, as bursts of snow blew fiercely across the tundra. I wouldn't want to be walking in conditions like this, but I had to remind myself that I was not Aunt Louise, and she was a lot stronger than I was. If my aunt had been a horse in this life, she'd have been a Belgian draught horse, that in the olden days were used for carrying sleighs, ploughs, and carriages. That was how indestructible Aunt Louise seemed to be at times, which meant I was forgiven for sometimes believing she wasn't a woman, despite how feminine she was. My sister, sensing my obvious concern, drew my attention away from my worries, so we continued playing our game of snakes and ladders. 15 minutes later, my mother returned to the living room. She looked flustered, rather ashen in the face, like a chicken in a coop that has been rudely disturbed by a fox. She hurriedly marched over to the window, staring out towards the trees. She shook her head furiously, her whole body jiggling in indignation. "Where has your aunt got to?" she almost growled. "She should be back by now. Look at the wind. It's getting a whole lot worse. Why the hell won't your aunt listen to me? Something's happened. I know it has. I can feel it in my bones. But your Aunt Louise is up to her old tricks again, causing us to worry. Twice we had to rescue her from a blizzard, and she still hasn't learnt a damn thing." My mother's rather ominous words were playing the same dreadful tune in my head over and over again. The only difference, she was expressing her misgivings outwardly. "You worry too much, Mummy," my sister interjected. "Aunt Louise can look after herself. She's going to be fine. I know she is." "That's the problem," my mother said. "I don't think your Aunt Louise is fine. How can she possibly be fine if she's not back yet? I'm going to have to go out there myself and find her. I hate going out there in such disagreeable, obnoxious weather like this. But I haven't got a choice, have I? I'm telling you, if your aunt dares to come back in one piece, looking as if I've been worrying about nothing, I'll kill her myself. I will wring her neck like a chicken. And I'm not joking either. She knows I will worry if she takes too long on her walks. How can she do this to me? How can she?" I watched my mother, padding herself in layers of insulating warm outdoor wear, so that she would be fully insulated from the cold. She was wearing exactly the same warm clothes as Aunt Louise was wearing when she left the house, so if I was to see her walking back through the trees, I could easily mistake her for Aunt Louise. Finally she put on her woolly hat and her red leather gloves, and looked up at us. "I won't be very long, kids. I'm going to find that aunt of yours, if it kills me, and when I find her, I'm going to have her guts for garters, because she's got some explaining to do." "Do you want me to call Daddy?" I said. "He could come with you to help you look for Aunt Louise." "I'm not going to disturb your father," said my mother. "He's very busy at the moment. Besides, you know what he's like. He'll tell me I'm panicking for nothing. I can do this myself. I'm going to look for your Aunt Louise, and I won't be long." I watched my mother from the lounge window, following Aunt Louise's fading footsteps in the snow, as more snow began to fall. The wind was quite bracing. I couldn't help feeling sorry for my mother, for the last thing she wanted to be doing was to find Aunt Louise. But I guess she couldn't stand waiting for Aunt Louise to get back, so it was better to go looking for her. My sister Gretchen was exactly like Aunt Louise in so many ways. I realized how extraordinary their likeness was. She was smiling up at me, and seemed so grown up all of a sudden. She was very clever for a girl of 8. Many people could not believe she was that young, but I guess you grow up fast in Alaska, as everything here tends to be bigger. "What's so funny?" I asked her. "Penny for your thoughts." "Mum's making such a terrible fuss about Aunt Louise, isn't she?" "I promise you, Aunt Louise is absolutely fine. She'll be back soon. Come on, let's carry on playing our game. We keep being interrupted, and it's very, very annoying." I reluctantly sat down on the carpeted floor, close to the crackling fire, trying desperately to concentrate on our game of snakes and ladders. But it was a struggle to focus. My heart was wildly aflutter, my mind a chaotic, tangled spin, my thoughts going around and around in circles, like the clothes in a spin-dryer. Why wasn't Aunt Louise back from her walk yet, I wondered. It was a short while later I heard Pipkin excitedly barking, and inwardly I sighed with relief. It could only mean one thing. Aunt Louise was back. Silly me, I'd been worrying about nothing. My sister grinned. "That's them," she told me. "Aunt Louise and Pipkin are back. I told you you were worrying about nothing." Me and my sister instinctively ran over to the window. I was expecting to see my mother and Aunt Louise trudging together through the snow, walking side by side. My mother clearly giving her an earful about how worried she'd been, and how selfish Aunt Louise had been to venture out of doors like this, in such bracing weather. I was naturally expecting to see Pipkin rambunctiously leading the way, with his nose dragging along the snow, and his blonde upright tail wagging furiously. But that is not what I saw. In that quintessential moment, I scrunched up my eyes, as I was sure the vision I was seeing just did not correlate with what I was expecting to see. I almost thought my vision had become somewhat distorted, impaired and blurry. This couldn't be right, could it? Who the hell was that? The wind was blowing quite badly by now. It was wailing aggressively, and beating against the front door of the cabin with loud, obtrusive banging sounds. I could see Pipkin nonchalantly running next to a strange man. He was so incredibly big. He must have been at least 10 foot tall. I'd never seen anyone a day in my life so arrestingly big. That the size of this man took my breath away. He could be in the Guinness Book of Records, I thought, for being one of the tallest people in the world. I'd never seen anyone quite so big in all my life. He was either wearing a woolly onesie, or he was covered in thick dark hair like a black bear. He was powerfully built with a strapping body, and wasn't wearing any boots on his feet. My heart almost plummeted when I saw this huge man appear to be carrying a bundle in his arms. I looked at the bundle more closely, and realized to my horror it was Aunt Louise. She seemed to be asleep. What was wrong with Aunt Louise? Me and Gretchen, realizing that Aunt Louise must be in trouble, unhesitantly ran out of the cabin towards the huge man, without even bothering to put on any outer protective wear. I'd never seen anyone look like this man before, but at 10 years old, his rather peculiar unorthodox appearance was the very least of my concerns. My undivided focus was more on Aunt Louise than the man walking towards our cabin. When he walked, he made light weight of the heavy snow, and the wind, with its powerful whips, it didn't seem to deter him at all. "What happened?" I asked once I finally reached the man. "Is Aunt Louise all right?" The big man spoke to us in a strange language. "Campantilanoko, asila tua, hina fila bono." But before I could say, "I don't understand what you're saying, sir. Do you speak English?" the meaning of the words seemed to just drift into my mind, almost as if I knew exactly what he was saying. It was only after the strange encounter I thought it was weird that I'd been able to comprehend his strange dialect. How did that happen? "It's windy, and it's very bad out there. A big gust of wind blew her into a tree. She's out cold. She needs help. Where can I put her? She needs to sleep it off, and in her case, it's going to be a long, long sleep." I hurriedly opened the cabin door, where this huge man was so big he had to turn his body to one side and bend his head to duck right under the door frame to get into our house, because he was that big, and our door was a large one. "Is she going to be all right?" asked my sister, looking up at the big man, who rather reminded me of King Kong, only his face was remarkably human. It seemed the most natural thing in the world to be talking to this hairy man. Pipkin seemed to like the hairy man as well, and that dog was always a good judge of character. My father once had a friend around at the cabin to stay for a couple of days, and Pipkin didn't like him in the least. He growled at him tirelessly, and would not let Aunt Louise out of his sight. That was how discerning Pipkin was. The huge man carefully laid Aunt Louise down on the couch. I tried to wake her up myself, but she continued to sleep. I could feel she did have a pulse and was breathing, but something was wrong with her, because she wouldn't wake up. That was really strange, I thought. The hairy man shook his head and said, "She's going to have a very long sleep. But yes, she will wake up one of these days. Not to worry about that. Just keep her nice and warm for the time being. Inta kikakwanse ha kilasobo masalatina." "How do you know she'll wake up, sir?" I asked him.
"Conto la mattina calosopo coloni a cansaquani hicolopona." "Because it's not her time," said the man. "You need to let her rest. Don't disturb her." And before I could ask the hairy man any more questions, he had simply sashayed out of our house and gone from our sight.
"Who was that?" asked my sister. "I never seen him around here before. He seems so nice. I can't believe he's got hair all over his body, so he doesn't have to wear clothes like we do. He's very lucky, don't you think?" "Pipkin, stop that!" I reprimanded. "Stop licking Aunt Louise's face. The big hairy man says she needs to sleep and get lots of rest, so leave her alone, will you?" Pipkin failed to listen to me. He pawed at Aunt Louise, licking her face, whining and looking up at us with dark eyes, as if to say, "Why don't you do something? Wake her up." "Let her sleep, Pipkin," said my sister. "The hairy man says she needs lots and lots of rest." Moments later we heard a door slam, and then we heard my mother running through the house. She seemed out of breath, and she was saying, "I can't find your Aunt Louise anywhere. What on earth am I going to do? I think I'm going to need your father's help after all. This is such a fiasco, such a dreadful mess. The weather is frightful out there. The wind is blowing up badly. Something is terribly wrong with your Aunt Louise. She's missing." My mother practically wailed as she said this. The fear in her eyes was palpable. "Aunt Louise is back! She's just having a nap," I said matter-of-factly. "She mustn't be disturbed. She's very, very tired, you see." "Why didn't you tell me this, Donovan? Can't you see I'm practically having a meltdown?" "She's back, is she?" said my mother, looking at me nonplussed. "You say she's taking a nap? Are you kidding me? I'm going to kill her for putting me through so much grief. She has the blatant audacity to go to sleep. Are you kidding me? She has lessons to teach. Has she forgotten her responsibilities here? What is wrong with that woman? In fact, what is wrong with everybody this morning? Is there something in the water?" My mother stormed into the living room, looking so ferocious that I almost became afraid of her. My mother rushed over to Aunt Louise and shouted, "Get up, will you? I can't believe you're taking a nap. How could you do this? You go off for a walk in terrible, terrible weather, and you come back afterwards to vegetate on the couch. I've been worried sick about you. We all have been. You need to get up right now. I'm not putting up with this nonsense a moment longer. What the hell are you playing at, woman?" As my mother shook her sister, her face drained of all its colour. "What is wrong with her?" she asked, looking up at us with a puzzled expression on her face. "She's sleeping," my sister said. "She needs to sleep. The man says she must have a long sleep before she wakes up. Can you see? She's very, very tired." "Don't be ridiculous," my mother said. "She's not sleeping. She's out for the count. We've got to get your father at once. Something dreadful has happened to your aunt. She's not waking up. But thank God she's breathing, that's all I can say. She needs to go to the hospital at once. How on earth did she manage to get back into the cabin on her own? In this state, I ask you." "She didn't. The big man brought her here," I told my mother. My mother was so dismayed by the state of my aunt, as there was no outward signs as to why she appeared to be comatose. I don't think my mother heard my references to the large man, who had so kindly rescued Aunt Louise and carried her all the way to the cabin, laying her down very carefully on the couch in the living room. The next thing I knew was my dad arrived on the scene, asking what the hell was going on, and what was the commotion all about. He took one look at Aunt Louise and knew something was decidedly wrong. Without asking any questions, he didn't waste a single second of time and immediately took Aunt Louise to his vehicle, where he propped her up in the back seat with blankets and pillows, and then he was gone, rocketing through the snow at an incredible speed. He told my mother he was going to the hospital and he'd keep her posted as to how Aunt Louise was doing. My mother looked tormented to be left at home, but I guess she had to stay behind to watch over us. My mother was clearly overwrought with worry. I could see it written on her face, and I felt so desperately sorry for her. "Is Aunt Louise going to be all right, Mummy?" my sister Gretchen asked her. "Why didn't she wake up?" "That's an excellent question you ask, Gretchen," my mother said, "one of which I do not know the answer to. I have absolutely no idea or comprehension about what happened to your aunt out there on the tundra. I can only imagine." My mother shook her head furiously. "I just wish your Aunt Louise would listen to me. Why does she have to be so damn carefree, so dreadfully insouciant about things? You saw me, didn't you? I tried to persuade your aunt not to go out with the wind letting up like that. But you know your Aunt Louise. Nothing will stop her walking Pipkin unless there's a fierce blizzard blowing. That woman thinks she can conquer all weather, and she can't. She needs to realise her limitations. She's not built like a snowplough, you know. What is wrong with her? How on earth is it that she just can't wake up?" My mother suddenly looked at us. "Do you know what happened?" she said suddenly, as if it had only just occurred to her that we might be able to fill in some of the blanks for her, from this enigmatic conundrum, so to speak. "How did your Aunt Louise manage to get to the couch to lie down on her own? And when she did, what condition was she in when she returned to the cabin? Did you even actually get to see her before she settled down on the couch to go to sleep? Did you see anything at all?"
"No, silly," said my sister. "Aunt Louise was fast asleep when she came to the cabin. So the very big, hairy man carried her here and put her on the couch for us. He was very nice, wasn't he, Donovan?"
I nodded. My mother looked perplexed. "But who is this man you're talking about? Did he give you a name? There are no random strangers living around here, you know. How did your aunt ever run into him in the first place? Who is he?"
"I don't know who he is," I told my mother, "but he's very nice. He told us that Aunt Louise was going to have a long sleep and then she would wake up. He told us not to disturb her, but to keep her nice and warm. He put her down on the couch and we covered her with a blanket and brought her a pillow."
"But did he tell you what happened to your Aunt Louise?" my mother asked us, seemingly determined to get to the bottom of this mystery.
"Well, he said the wind got very bad. It was blowing badly and Aunt Louise was flung into a tree. She hit it hard and then she fell asleep."
"I knew it. I knew something like this would happen. That sister of mine, she just drives me crazy. Always having to do what she wants to do, never thinking about the rest of us, not for a moment." "You say the man witnessed this whole event," my mother continued. "How extraordinary! What on earth was a perfect stranger, I ask you, doing in these parts? If I ever see him again, I must thank him for his kindness, to your aunt, that is. She was knocked out cold, and if he hadn't found her, God forbid, she could be lying there in these treacherous, unforgiving conditions, and maybe no one would be able to find her. Oh, dear me, the thought is too dreadful to even contemplate." I am not exactly sure what was going on with my Aunt Louise, as when my father returned home from Anchorage, he informed us that Aunt Louise had been admitted to hospital, but he didn't reveal very much to us.
"Is she going to be all right, Daddy?"
Gretchen asked him.
"Of course she's going to be fine, Bug,"
my dad said. But as kids, we picked up pretty easily that there was doubt in my father's eye. My mother rushed forwards into my father's arms and sobbed into his shirt, saying over and over again, "Why wouldn't she listen? Why wouldn't she listen? I told her not to go out into the weather, but you know how obstinately stubborn Louise is. I can't believe she's got a head injury of all things, after flying into a tree. You wouldn't suspect a thing, would you, looking at her, I mean?"
"No, you wouldn't," my father agreed. "But that's because the bleeding is all internal, and the damage is on the inside, although there is a significant amount of swelling on the head. Look, love," my father told my mother, "it's still early days, and things can change, so we need to remain extremely positive and get on with our lives as we always do, taking one day at a time."
"But I can't just pick up the pieces of my life without Louise around," my mother protested indignantly. "She's part of me. When she's hurting, so am I."
"I understand, love, but you're going to have to be strong for your sister's sake and for our family. As I was saying, it's early days. A lot can change."
"But what do the doctors think?"
"I don't know what they think. They didn't reveal much. I told you, they told me it was a waiting game. We just need to be upbeat about this. You can visit your sister as often as you like in hospital. Don't worry about the children. I will stay with them here at the cabin."
I really wanted to know what was going on with Aunt Louise, but I'm afraid to say my parents did not reveal much. There was much hushed talk among my parents. They didn't want us to know what was going on with our Aunt Louise. I asked my somewhat evasive father, who was never forthcoming, if Aunt Louise had woken up yet, and whether her condition had got worse or better.
"She sustained a head injury, son," my father told me rather cautiously. "There is some internal bleeding and swelling on the brain. They're doing lots of tests, aren't they? Currently she's in a coma."
"What does coma mean, Dad?" I asked.
"What it means, Donovan, is that your Aunt Louise is sleeping currently," my mother interjected. "Let's just say she hasn't woken up yet. But I'm very certain she's going to be fine and make a full recovery." But my mother's words sounded vacuously hollow and non-committal. She and my father would exchange these private looks, which made me in no uncertain doubt that Aunt Louisa's health was declining, and knowing this scared the bejesus out of me. What if we never saw Aunt Louise again? What if Aunt Louise died? I tried to shut out those horrifying thoughts, but I was riddled with an infestation of worry that refused to abate, and at 10 years old, I felt as if I was carrying the entire weight of the world on my very small, narrow shoulders. So there we are. That is the end of part 2. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.